right, that brings us to JFK Jr.'s accident in quotes. July 16th, 1999, small plane he was piloting, it was a Piper Saratoga, crashed into the Atlantic Ocean near Martha's Vineyard. His wife, Carolyn Bassett Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bassett, also on board, died in the crash. The NTSB ruled the probable cause of the crash was pilot error due to spatial disorientation in hazy conditions. And Kennedy was flying without an instructor, reportedly lost control of the aircraft. So let's talk about some of the suspicious circumstances and some of the conspiracy theories surrounding his death. Let's start with the one of the earliest things that came out. There was no Mayday call.
Yeah, no, well, and that's because there was an earlier report, and I wrote about a lot about this in Hidden History and in American Memory Hole. I have a lot of new stuff, and people, it's amazing the stuff I discovered about it. I was the first one really to do a full investigation into it. There's no question it was another Kennedy assassination, but yeah, not only was no Mayday call at 9:39 p.m. UPI, ABC. It was reported all across the mainstream media that there was a 9:30 p.m. phone call from JFK Jr. awaiting landing instructions and reporting everything was fine. Now later they would claim 9:39 is the exact moment that his plane went into a death spiral. So they had to get rid of that. Now I have again, this is the value of live news coverage. I had researcher Scott Myers in Texas who was early on uh, doing a lot of work on this case. He sent me live coverage of local WCVB TV in Boston, early coverage of the search for JFK, and it's wonderful to watch that because there are so many references to that 9:39 p.m. phone call. They talk about it constantly. That's later had didn't happen. And what's more important, they have an interview, and this is the American Memory Hall has an update on this. I don't want to spoil it because I want people to buy the book. But it's amazing when I discovered that. But there was the Coast Guard sent out a guy named Todd Bergen, who was a petty officer. And he had an interview with Susan Warnick, who was one of the reporters that now retired from WCBB TV. I have that interview on tape. And the interview is exclusively about the 9:39 p.m. phone call. Now, as what happened, of course, this is a phone call that didn't happen. So we're supposed to believe the Coast Guard sent out a petty officer to talk about a non-existent phone call. And Susan Warnick, unlike some of the other reporters there, did answer my emails. And a guy named Steve Bracia was volunteered how curious he thought. He said something didn't smell right about that case. He didn't believe a lot of the story. Uh, Susan Warnick never answered my email request because I was going to say, what about this? I tried for a long time to get a hold of Todd Bergen. I finally was able to when I was writing American Emerald. And again, people, I don't want to put a spoiler, but his reaction was interesting to say the least, and I think very illuminating. But clearly there was a 9:39 p.m. phone call. Clearly they sent this guy out to talk about something that existed that's very important. And just as important was Steve Zabratia. He was the guy who saw this reporter for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, a little newspaper for the rich and famous there. Biggest story that they ever had, because this guy's the only one who talked to this witness on the shore that saw an explosion in the sky at the exact same time. Saw his Kennedy's plane exploding. Never identified. Steve Bracia told me he could identify him in the court of law. He described him to me, an older guy with salt and pepper hair. Now, they again, that was down, and this was reported, UPI and all the AP, National Press Services, that this witness from the Martha's Vineyard Gazette saw this. There's another reporter, Victor Polbranick, who heard an explosion in the sky at the same time. So they had a couple witnesses to something, especially the unidentified one. But while writing my book, I tried to get a hold of the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, and it's just amazing. I mean, the editor they claimed she had never heard of the story. So I was there in those days, and I don't remember that. This is by far, I mean, they're probably reporting on, who's at the latest big party cookout or something there.
Mm-hmm.
How could you not? I mean, that's the biggest story they ever had. I don't remember anything about that. And
Mm.
okay, so you remember nothing about that, huh? So we've never identified this guy, if he's alive or not, we don't know. But those I think are two of the, and then if you look at what I was able to discover with my investigation, I talked to JFK Jr.'s high school girlfriend. I talked to a member of his adult inner circle who very adamantly said, I have to remain anonymous. not want to go on the record, who talked about that behind the scenes, JFK Jr. He was like me. He was reading the same books I was reading at the same time. He was obsessed with his father's death, alone among the Kennedys. He knew it was a conspiracy, and he had a quest to expose it.
Let me
And
ask you, just
later,
let me jump in here because, of course, he published George magazine.
yes,
Everyone assumed it was named after George Washington. Some have speculated that it was kind of
I've heard that. Yeah,
a wink of the eye, that he was
yeah.
basically pointing to the person maybe behind his father's assassination, George Bush. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I've heard that. I don't tend because I think these things happen above the level of Bushes. And at the time of the JFK assassination, George H.W. Bush was a fairly young guy. He was probably affiliated with the CIA, but he was pretty far down the food chain. I know people say that, and there's a picture of him, and they think it was him in Dealey Plaza. Maybe everybody was there apparently, but I think these things happen above that level. I mean that's possible. It could have been an inside joke or whatever. But I think JFK Jr., like me, was very, very well read. I think I could have had some great conversations with him because I'm sure he knew all about the minutiae of the case.
Okay, so we talked about the Mayday call, no Mayday call. We talked about the phone call he made asking for clearance to land at 9:39. Then there's the whole discrepancy in the weather reports because we're told this was
Yes, yes,
pilot error due to spatial disorientation, which happened in the night hazy weather.
yeah,
But the pilot reports at the time indicated it was clear skies and good visibility.
absolutely. And I contacted Eugene Meyer, who I communicated with him. He wrote the official weather report and conditions that night for the FAA. And he was at the time he was very public about how mad he was at the media. So he said, you guys are putting out disinformation, if you will, that the weather was fine that night. JFK was not reckless. He was completely qualified. And he reiterated that to me later when I was writing and I contacted him. He answered back an email. He was even more angrier at the media for these lies that they continue to tell. And you'll see it on every special about him, every article written about him. It stressed he was reckless. Reckless. They love using that term with the Kennedys. And that he basically was completely responsible. He took the lives of his wife and sister-in-law because he was so reckless, and he wasn't paying attention. He wasn't qualified. His foot was injured. Maybe he was drinking. I mean, they just throw all kinds of charges out. It was so hazy. And again, the guy that wrote I don't know anybody who would know better than the guy who wrote the official weather report on the FAA for that night. He said it was not hazy. The weather conditions were fine. JFK Jr. was more than qualified. I quote from his flight instructors in there. He talked about how careful he was. He was not reckless, and he was more than qualified to make this flight. So again, but that gets in kind of the deeper subject, and I talk about that in American Memory Hole too, against kind of the war against the Kennedys. It goes back to old Joe Kennedy, and I've talked. I think I'm the only guy on the earth defending old Joe Kennedy, but a lot of it goes back to that, and you still see it. You see it now with RFK Jr., the latest manifestation. The elite despises these candidates, and they treat them different because again they come from the same supposed liberal Democratic Party nest as Truman and FDR and even LBJ and Clinton and Obama. None of them get bad press. There's a book out now called Ask Not, which is by this
Yeah.
this New York Post writer, Margaret Callahan, who is an absolute lunatic. Before she wrote this book, I took her to task in American Memory Hole for a couple columns she wrote. I mean, she knows nothing about anything. She writes like a spurned lover. Like she made advances to RFK Jr. and he rejected her. She knows nothing. And she wrote the most ridiculous book where it takes all the scurrilous rumors that are based on nothing but CIA or mafia sources that they're based on anything, and translates it into a campaign to stop RFK Jr. He's crazy. He's throwing bears in parks and trying to make him look as stupid as crazy as possible. And he is eccentric, but that's the kind of media you're going to get. You're going to get that. So she would just scoff at any notion that JFK Jr. was killed because he was crazy, he was reckless. That's
Okay.
what we have to contend with.
Very quickly, the search. There was such a delay, like 15 hours after the plane
Yeah,
disappeared. Why?
yeah.
Why do you? What was happening in those 15 hours?
I think we can only speculate, but yeah, why was there a delay? And why didn't they go right to they had a signal from the area supposedly. Why they didn't go right there for some unknown reason. And the only reason it was apparently, and again, I have the way this progressed from people trying to call and get somebody interested. It took a call from Ted Kennedy to Clinton himself, supposedly to get the ball rolling, and then he sent out the military, which was odd because JFK Jr. had no military service. He wasn't an elected representative, so really, but again, then they could control the situation, and they did. And so yeah, there's feel, and then you can look at the burial at sea. And in American Memory Hall, I have a lot more detail. People will be amazed about that, about all this stuff about how JFK Jr. Was going to be buried at Arlington Cemetery originally. Other requests about where he would be buried, arguments between where the Bassett's would be buried. There was no talk of cremation at all. And then suddenly cremation, even the Boston Globe questioned it because it was very quickly, no history of cremation in the Kennedy family for Catholics, done at sea. Unfortunately, Ted Kennedy was there overseeing it all. I guess he'd been through enough, conspiracies, and he just completely sold out. But the entire story from beginning to end is, and then if you look at not only if you want any further evidence of why he was killed, Wayne Madsen, an independent journalist who I know, I talked to him, and he was being interviewed for George Magazine for a job by JFK Jr. He was supposed to meet with him that week, a few days after his plane disappeared, and he had been told his first assignment was going to be the assassination of President Kennedy. So George Magazine was about to have an expose on his father's. Just imagine what that kind of news would have done. And it was coinciding with his appearance in the political scene, and he was going to run for office.
Do you think he was going to run for Senate in New York in 2000 against Hillary Clinton?
That's what it looks like. It looks like that seems to be what he was planning to do. So you could even again then you throw the Clintons in, and people think, oh, see, Hillary knocked him off again. I think it was above that level. But I guess if you want to include it on that, you can. But that's he wanted to be president. But yeah, I think he people forget how young he was. He was only 38. So he wasn't like he just belatedly entered politics. He bided his time, but he was that was his issue, and that's what they try to hide. And in American Memory Hall, have more of that, and you can even see in Carolyn Kennedy's attack video on RFK Jr. is that because she's incensed at RFK Jr. because he talks so much about the assassinations. Her and JFK Jr. at the time of his death was a lot of friction between them, and it's not mentioned, but I think the main source of that friction was the assassination because she doesn't want any mention of it. And he's talking about it all the time. I'm going to go into politics. So imagine that.